he said it the moment she walked through the door. Not a greeting, not a welcome, just, "I don't need a wife. I need someone who won't lose their nerve when it matters." She had been standing in the doorway of his clinic, with 3 days of Wyoming dust on her coat and a bag in each hand, and she looked at Dr. Gideon Cray across the narrow room and said, "Then I'm exactly what you sent for." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not warmth, a recalibration, the way a man recalculates when the numbers don't come out the way he expected. Then he turned back to the tray he'd been organizing and told her where to put her things. Phoebe Danner had read the advertisement 4 times before she answered it. Frontier physician Colton Creek, Wyoming Territory, seeks capable assistant. Medical experience required. Marriage expected by territorial law for residency arrangement. Inquire to Dr. G. Cray. She had been 27 years old with a room in a Cincinnati boarding house, a trunk that fit under the bed, and 3 years of field hospital work behind her that had ended, not because the war did, but because she had finally run out of places to put what she'd seen. The engagement to the man her mother had approved of had dissolved 6 months after the armistice, quietly, the way things dissolve when 2 people realize they've become strangers. She had no living parents. She had a practical mind, steady hands, and the particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from not being used for what you were built for. She had written back to Dr. Cray the same evening. The train west took 4 days, then a wagon north through Wyoming land so open it made Cincinnati feel like a room she'd been locked in without knowing it. The sky out here was larger, more honest, not framed by rooftops or mill smoke. She had watched it through the window with her hands in her lap and thought, for the first time in months, forward. Just forward. Colton Creek was a mining town trying to decide whether it was dying. 2 saloons, a general store, a church with a cracked bell, and a main street of hard-packed dirt that turned to mud when it rained and to dust when it didn't. The clinic sat at the north end of town, a low wooden building with a painted sign beginning to peel at the corners. Gideon Cray had been the only doctor within 60 miles for 11 years. He was 40, or close to it, lean in the way of men who forget to eat, with gray already threading through his dark hair and eyes the color of creek water in autumn, a brown so deep it was almost black, and completely still. He moved through his own clinic like a man performing familiar rites without believing in them anymore. When he looked at her, it was with the expression of someone who had been disappointed enough times to stop investing in expectations. Phoebe understood that look. She had worn a version of it herself. She put her bag down in the small room off the back of the clinic that he showed her without ceremony. She took in the spare furniture, the single window, the hook on the wall, with nothing hanging from it. Then she rolled up her sleeves and asked him where he kept the carbolic. The first week was an education in working beside someone who had decided not to need anything. Gideon Cray was competent in the way that comes from long practice and no one watching, thorough, precise, unsentimental. He didn't ignore her exactly, but he moved around her the way a man moves around furniture he hasn't decided what to do with, and he communicated in sentences that contained exact information as was necessary and nothing beyond. She learned his system, and then she improved it without announcing she was doing so. The supply cabinet had been organized by category. She reorganized it by frequency of use, the things he reached for most placed at eye level. He noticed on the 3rd day. He didn't say anything, but she caught him pausing in front of it with an expression that was not quite approval and not quite surprise. She was more observant than he gave her credit for. Most people were, she'd found, when a man had decided not to look. She watched the patients, too, not just their symptoms, their patterns. In the first week, 7 people came in with the same presentation. Fatigue that came on fast, nausea, a particular yellowing at the corners of the eyes she'd seen once before in a camp outside Chattanooga, from water that had run through spoiled ground. She wrote it down in her own notebook, the one she'd kept since field hospital days, with dates and names and where in town each patient lived. 6 of the 7 lived in the southern quarter of Colton Creek, down by the creek bend. She didn't say anything yet. She kept watching. The house where Gideon lived was connected to the clinic by a covered passage, and she had not been inside it until the 9th day, when he asked her to retrieve a reference text from his study, and she walked through a door and into someone else's life. Not his life exactly, a version of it that had stopped. The study was a reasonable room, books, a desk covered in papers, a window with a view of the North Ridge. But on the windowsill there was a tin cup with a child's drawings stuffed in it, the way children stuff drawings everywhere, certain that someone will want them. 3 drawings. A horse that was clearly a horse only if you already knew what horses looked like. A house with smoke from the chimney. A figure with long braids and a smile wider than her face, labeled in large, careful letters, Pa. Phoebe stood in front of those drawings for a moment too long. She found the reference text and left. That night at supper, they ate together in the same wordless way they did most things, the practical arrangement of 2 people sharing space. She did not mention what she'd seen. She had learned long ago that some things needed to be come to, not asked after. But she looked at Gideon Cray differently from that point on. She looked at the way he held himself with the door closed against something he couldn't shut out, and she thought, I know this. Not the same grief, but the same architecture. The breaking point came on the 12th day, and it came from inside his own walls. She had been writing up her observations, her notebook open beside the clinic register, when he came in from the back and saw her comparing the 2 documents. She watched him take in the scene, her handwriting, his register, the rough map of Colton Creek she'd sketched with marks at each patient's residence. What are you doing? He said. Looking at a pattern, she said, and turned the notebook so he could see. 7 patients in 11 days with the same symptom presentation. 6 of them live within a quarter mile of each other, south end of town. All of them draw water from the Price Creek branch. He didn't move. You've been keeping separate records. You keep the clinical register, she said. I keep observations. It's how I was trained. Something in his jaw tightened. Those are my patients. Yes, she said, and they're getting sick from the same source, and I think you already suspect something is wrong, because 3 of those patients have been in twice this month, and you've been treating symptoms without a diagnosis. She held his eyes. I'm not criticizing you. I'm showing you what I found. The room was very quiet. He crossed to the table and looked at the map. He looked at it the way a man looks when information is landing somewhere that matters, working through it, his eyes moving between her marks and the creek line she'd drawn. The Price operation, he said finally, and his voice had changed. Something had gone out of it that had been flat and defensive before. Sterling Price's mining diversion is upstream of the South Quarter draw, she said. I walked out there yesterday morning. He looked up. You went to the Price site alone. I went for a walk, she said. I looked at the water. It has a particular smell. Arsenic leaching from the ore processing, he said, and the words came out with the heaviness of something he'd suspected and refused to complete the thought on. I've been treating it as fever. I didn't. He stopped. I should have seen it. You see what you're looking for, she said, keeping her voice even. I came in without assumptions. That's the only difference. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the Wyoming afternoon pushed against the clinic windows, the particular sideways light of late summer in the high country. Show me what you need, he said at last. It was the first time he had said need in any context other than the clinical. She learned about his daughter from the postmaster's wife, the way she'd learned most things about Colton Creek, by listening when people talked around her as though she hadn't quite registered yet. Her name had been Bess. She had been 6 years old. She had died 3 years ago of the same kind of fever, the same presentation, the same yellowing at the corners of the eyes, and she had been the first patient Gideon Cray could not save. After that, his wife had taken her grief to her sister in Denver and not come back, and Gideon had stayed because there was no one else, and because leaving felt like the last thing Bess would have expected of him. Phoebe sat with that for a long time after she heard it. She thought about the drawing labeled Pa. She thought about the way Gideon moved through rooms as though he was always slightly late, to somewhere he'd already decided not to go. She thought about the water. She thought about Sterling Price's operation, which had started 4 years ago, a full year before Bess died, diverting and processing upstream of the South Quarter draw. She thought about that very carefully. The confrontation with Price came before she was ready, which was how confrontations usually came. She had gone to the land records office to pull the filings on the Price Creek diversion, water rights, processing permits, the dates everything had been registered. The clerk had been cooperative in the way of men who find her unexpected but not unwelcome, and she'd been deep in the records when a door opened at the back, and a voice came through it with the particular quality of authority, long exercised and rarely questioned. Sterling Price was a large man in good clothes, with the composure of someone who had spent decades watching other people move out of his way. He was perhaps 55, with white mutton chop whiskers and a watch chain across a vest that had cost more than most miners earned in a month. He looked at Phoebe at the record table with an expression that rearranged itself very quickly from surprise to something she recognized as management. "Mrs. Cray," he said pleasantly, "I wasn't aware the doctor's wife had an interest in mining law." "Water rights," she said, without looking up from the document in front of her. "I hope you're finding everything in order." "I'll let you know when I finish," she said. He settled into the chair across from her with the ease of a man who owned chairs everywhere he sat. "I've been meaning to call on you both," he said. "Welcome you properly. Colton Creek is a small community. We all depend on each other." She looked up then. "I read that your operation began processing upstream 4 years ago this August," she said, before the permit for the creek diversion was actually issued. A pause, very brief. "Permitting out here can take time to catch up with activity." "It can," she agreed. "I also read that the South Quarter well request was denied the same month your processing permit cleared." The residents stayed on creek water. She held his gaze. "Dr. Cray has been treating a consistent pattern of arsenical exposure in South Quarter residents for 3 years." The room went very still. Price's expression didn't change dramatically. Men like him didn't let it. But something behind the expression recalibrated, and she saw it, the same recalibration she'd seen in Gideon that first day, the recognition of a man finding that someone is seeing more than he expected. "That's a serious allegation," he said softly. "It's a medical observation," she said. "I worked field hospitals. I know what arsenic exposure looks like across a population, and I know what the creek water near your lower tailings pond smells like, and I know those two things are connected." She gathered her notes and stood. "Good afternoon, Mr. Price." She walked out into the high Wyoming air and kept her pace steady all the way back to the clinic. She sat at her desk and pressed both palms flat on the table and let herself breathe. When she checked her hands, they were trembling, only a little. They stopped before Gideon came in from rounds. She told him everything that evening, the records, the dates, Price's presence, the conversation, all of it. She told it plainly, without dramatizing, and he listened the way he listened to clinical information, with his full attention and nothing visible until she finished. Then he said, with a quietness that was the outer edge of something considerably less quiet, "He was there when you were alone." "He made no threats," she said. "He was civil. He was trying to determine what I know." "And what do you know?" She spread her notes on the table. "Enough, the processing began upstream 4 years ago. Bess died 3 years ago. The South Quarter residents have been drinking arsenic leachate from his tailings for 4 years, and the permit record shows his attorney filed the well denial request the same week the processing permit cleared." She looked at him. He knew what would happen to the water. He filed to keep them on it. Gideon was very still. "Bess lived in the South Quarter," he said, "when she was small. We were on Canal Street before I moved the practice up here." The clinic held that between them. "Yes," Phoebe said quietly, "I know." He stood up and walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, for a long time. She let him have it. She understood the shape of what was moving through him. Not grief alone, though grief was there, but the cold, particular fury of a man who finally understands what took something from him. "Is there enough to file a complaint?" he said at last. "Not yet," she said. "We need water samples tested by a licensed chemist, not just my field assessment. We need at least 2 other physicians to corroborate the symptom pattern. And we need to move before Price does, because the moment he suspects we're building a case, he'll obscure the tailings and reclaim the permits." She paused. "There's a federal Land Health Commission. If we file with them rather than the territorial authority, Price can't intercept the process the way he likely can locally." Gideon turned around. He was looking at her the way he hadn't since that first day. Really looking, not around her or past her, but at her. "You've been thinking this through since the 12th day," he said. "Yes," she said. Something moved across his face, slow, considerable, the way a season changes, not all at once, but unmistakably. "My daughter liked water," he said. It came out quiet, careful, like a thing he'd decided to say before he could prevent himself. She was always drawing boats. She'd never seen one. The stable hand used to take her to the creek in the mornings before rounds. He paused. She drew them from his descriptions. Every size. She said when she was grown she was going to ride one all the way to the ocean. He stopped. She was 6 years old. Phoebe did not say anything. "I keep thinking I should move her drawings," he said. "From the study window. They've been there 3 years." He looked at his hands. "I can't decide whether moving them means letting go or just putting her away." "Those aren't the same thing," Phoebe said. He looked at her. "You can put them somewhere better without letting go," she said. "That's not a contradiction." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, in the voice of a man who has arrived at a decision, "What do we do first?" She had been ready for this. "Water samples from 3 points on Price Creek. I'll take them to the assay office in Granger. The chemist there is a federal licensed analyst, and his findings carry weight in a federal filing. While I'm there, I'll write to 2 physicians in Cheyenne who have published on environmental illness. I have their addresses." She paused. "And I need you to begin keeping a formal patient log, every South Quarter case, full symptom documentation, dated, a formal statement of observed patterns over time, not just the clinical register, something that can be entered as evidence." Gideon nodded. "Then you said we." "Yes," she said. "I did." He held her gaze for a long, unguarded moment. Then he stood and said, "I'll make coffee. Tell me what you need for the sampling kit." She watched him move toward the stove, not the careful, purposeful movement of a man keeping distance, but simply moving, present and accounted for. And she turned back to her notes and allowed herself one small private thing before she put it away. Price moved 9 days later. He sent a letter, formal, legal, delivered by a man in town clothes who left without waiting for a reply. It cited a county health ordinance provision allowing review of a licensed physician who caused public alarm with unsupported claims. It requested, with the smooth politeness of a man accustomed to being obeyed, that Gideon cease discussing the water quality matter publicly pending review by the county medical board. The county medical board, whose chairman had accepted a significant donation from Price Mining the previous autumn. This was not in the letter. Phoebe found it in the newspaper archive at the general store the same afternoon. She read Gideon the letter and then the newspaper entry, and she watched his face move through comprehension and controlled anger, and something that settled finally into finality, the expression of a man who has stopped waiting and started moving. "He can't remove my license through a county board if a federal inquiry is already open," he said. "No," she agreed, "which means we file before he can move a second time." She put the chemist's analysis on the table. The water samples came back from Granger. Arsenic at 4 times safe exposure threshold at the lower tailings draw, signed and certified. Gideon looked at the report. His hands were very still on the paper. "I should have seen it sooner," he said. "The Aldred children have been sick off and on for 2 years. I told myself it was the general run of childhood illness out here. His jaw worked. I told myself that." "You were looking for disease," she said. "I was looking for pattern. You couldn't have built the case without the records I pulled, and I couldn't have built it without your patient history. That's what this is." She paused. "That's what we is." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in the look had changed from even a week ago, the walls still present. She could feel them, but thinner now, or perhaps she had finally learned where the doors were. "I know a man in Laramie," he said. "A federal health commissioner. We trained at the same hospital in Philadelphia before I came out here." He paused. "I haven't spoken to him in years." "Write to him tonight," she said. "It might not come to anything," he said. "It might come to everything," she said. He looked at her across the notes, spread between them, the lamp burning low, the Wyoming night pressing dark and cold against the clinic windows, and for just a moment the careful distance between them felt like something that was making less and less sense, a habit maintained past the point of purpose. "Phoebe," he said. Just her name the first time without the professional remove. "I know," she said, before he could say whatever came next. "Me too." He gathered the papers and squared them neatly and said, "I'll write to Commissioner Aldred tonight." "Good," she said. "I'll make coffee." She stood and went to the stove, and she was aware of him, still at the table, still looking at the place where she'd been sitting, And she did not turn around because some things need to be let alone to find their own way to the surface. But she was smiling when she put the kettle on. The federal inquiry opened on a Thursday. By Friday, the whole of Colton Creek knew. And instead of the division she'd feared, what spread through town was the release of pressure that had been building for years. The Aldred family arrived at the clinic with letters they'd kept, complaints about the water quality filed with the county that had never received a reply. Mrs. Whitman, a small direct woman who had been quiet at every public meeting for 2 years, came with her husband and daughter and said she wanted to give a statement to whoever needed one. 4 families came forward. Then 6. Then the schoolteacher, who had been treating persistent headaches in her students for 18 months and attributed it to the altitude, sat down across from Phoebe and wept with the particular relief of someone who has finally been told the thing they suspected was real. Gideon came home each evening and reported across the kitchen table, and Phoebe listened and asked questions and updated the file. He returned different each evening, still quiet, still careful, but a different quiet than the one he'd arrived with. A quiet that had people in it instead of walls. On the 7th evening he came in and said, "Tom Aldred told me he'd given up," and his voice held something it hadn't held when she arrived. He'd started believing the sickness was just what life out here required, that some places were hard and you absorbed it. Because no one had told him there was something to fight, Phoebe said. "I was supposed to tell him," Gideon said. "That's what I'm here for." "You couldn't fight what you couldn't see," she said. "You saw it," he said. "I saw it because I was new," she said. "Because I hadn't yet learned what to accept." She paused. "That's why you needed someone." He was quiet for a long moment. Then carefully, as though opening a door he'd kept shut a long time, "She used to sit on the stool by my desk in the mornings while I wrote my notes. Bess." She said the scratching sound of a pen was the most comfortable sound she knew. His voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of effort. "I haven't let anyone else sit on that stool." Phoebe looked at the stool. She had taken the chair across from it every day without thinking, without knowing. "I won't move it," she said. "I know," he said. "I know you won't." And the way he said it was not like a man granting permission. It was like a man who had been watching someone carefully for 9 weeks and arrived at a conclusion he trusted completely. The inquiry issued its findings on a Monday. Sterling Price's operation was confirmed as the source of contamination in Colton Creek's South Quarter water supply. Arsenic levels in the certified sample analysis exceeded safe exposure thresholds by 4 times. The processing diversion had been operating without proper downstream impact assessment. Immediate suspension of operations was issued pending full environmental review. The South Quarter families were told to use the North Well. A county pipeline would be funded. Price's permits were under federal review. It was not the end. There would be months of proceedings, legal arguments, the slow grind of federal process. But the water would be clean. The families would stop getting sick. The children would sleep without headaches. Phoebe was sitting at her desk when Gideon came in from the telegraph office with the confirmation in his hand, and she looked up at him, and she watched him see it on her face before he'd finished reading the page. "It held," he said, "not a question." "It held," she said. He set the telegram on the desk. He stood there with his hands at his sides, and she could see the full weight of it settling over him. Not triumph exactly, but the particular feeling of something long overdue arriving, like water finding its level. Then he crossed the room in 3 steps and said her name, just Phoebe, without anything careful around it, and she stood because she could feel what was coming and she wanted to be standing for it. "I don't know how to say this right," he said. "You don't have to say it right," she said. "You just have to say it." He looked at her the way he'd looked at the telegram, directly, with full attention and nothing managed. "I put that advertisement in the paper because I was drowning in the practical things, and I told myself that was the whole reason. Someone to manage the clinic. To cover the residency clause." He paused. "I was lying to myself." She waited. "I was lying because the true reason was that I'd stopped believing anything could be different," he said, "and I needed someone who still believed it." The clinic was very quiet around them. Outside, the Wyoming afternoon was moving toward evening, the particular gold of late summer light coming through the window sideways, touching everything with the quality of things that have lasted. Stay, he said. Not for the clinic. Not for the residency. Stay because. He stopped. Because when you came in that first morning and reorganized the supply cabinet without a word, I stood in front of it for 10 minutes thinking about how long it had been since anything improved. Phoebe looked at him, at the gray threading through his hair, and the crease at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting at small print by lamplight, and the particular stillness of a man who has said the hardest thing and is now simply waiting. I was already staying, she said. I decided that by the second week. He exhaled, long, slow, complete, and it contained everything he wasn't going to say in words, which was how she had come to understand him, through what the silences held. He reached out and took her hand, not briefly, with no evident intention of letting go. Bess would have liked you, he said quietly. She liked people who did things. Phoebe pressed her hand over his. Tell me more about the boats, she said. And so he did. He sat beside her at her desk on the stool he hadn't let anyone use, and he talked about his daughter with the fullness of a man speaking language that had been waiting years for the right listener. Her voice, the way she ran, the 3 different laughs she had for 3 different kinds of joy, and Phoebe listened with her whole self, and the clinic held them both in the early evening light, practical and honest, and warm with the particular life of a place that has remembered what it is for. A year after Phoebe Danner arrived in Colton Creek with dust on her coat and a bag in each hand, she was still there. She was always going to be still there. She had known it by the second week, the way you know things that matter, not all at once, but with a building certainty that doesn't ask for proof because it already has it. She had come west going toward something instead of away, and she had found it. A man who needed reminding he was still a healer, a town that needed someone to name what ailed it, and a life that fit her the way good work fits capable hands. Exactly, and without apology. She started a fire in a cold clinic, and the fire did not go out.